Hello, I'm Emma Irwin, and this is Practice Talks, an iteration of a podcast about languaging design. Today I'm here with Celeste Williams, who is a technician at Regents University in the design department. And today we're going to be talking about technical things, practice, design, and making. Me and Celeste met at Goldsmiths in 2017. And since then, Celeste, what have you been up to?
I have made stuff including furniture, hats, hot dogs, coffees, and posters and essays.
And essays, okay. Yeah. So on the topic of those essays, you've just done your PGCHE, and one of the things I found really interesting about this was you were telling me the content of it was very academic and very dry and very difficult. But one of the ways that you made it kind of accessible to you and your design practice was to make things.
Yeah, I remember when we met up to have a coffee and you were applying for the Masters and I was about to start the PGCHE and we went through it together and I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and both of us were like, that sounds quite academic. And then I was like, maybe I can make it into something else. And I think that's kind of what I did. When I started off, I was very aware that I hadn't been teaching for very long and that I was a technician rather than a tutor. And at the time that felt very important. But then eventually when we got to like talking about the content and going through the classes and everything, and then finally getting on to writing the essays, I found that being a technician was quite interesting, and I wanted to make sure that the essays' physical form reflected the theoretical ideas that were kind of written within it. And I think that was not only just because that's kind of the role of the technician, is to kind of move ideas from being theoretical into practice, into something tangible, but also because I wanted to be interested and I needed something to kind of get me to interact with the material genuinely, and I feel like making was the best way for that.
Yeah. So could you maybe give an example of something that you were writing about in one of those essays, and then how you kind of made it into a thing that was situated not only within kind of the pragmatics of pedagogies, like in order to teach, but also for your own practice?
It was the second essay, and it was about like a critical incident that had happened that changed the way that we went about teaching or thought about teaching. And in this essay, I was talking about this student that was struggling with measuring things, and there was a moment within there where I was kind of baffled about the fact that they didn't know how to measure something correctly.
Are you talking about like with a ruler?
Yeah, with a ruler.
Okay.
With a tape measure, with a ruler. And I felt like in that moment, they could have gone two ways. I could have made them feel bad about not knowing how to do something. Or I could kind of look at it as like, okay, well then this is an opportunity to learn and make them feel comfortable in the space in a way that sometimes I wish had been done more in my own education. And then within that kind of like story was all about like a lot of my research was then going into like radical empathy in teaching and kind of looking at teacher archetypes, but then flipping it on its head. So instead of students kind of having to accommodate to a certain teacher archetype, the teacher kind of like embodies a different archetype depending on the students that they have. And it felt almost like putting on like a costume, which is kind of what I do in my practice. I kind of have my overalls, and I kind of like slip on this technician persona. And so when I was writing about it, my first draft, my tutor had mentioned that it read almost like a play. So for my final submission, I submitted kind of like my essay as in like a play format, and they were the role of the technician, and I'd created all these tools and all of the props to kind of go with what they were going to kind of read. And then it was also an essay about accessibility and kind of making sure that like an inclusive practice in our teaching. And I knew that the tutor that I had was dyslexic. So I also printed everything on this kind of like pink paper with a font that makes it slightly easier and more accessible for people to read if they've got dyslexia. And it was all about making sure that the essay itself practiced what it was preaching. So obviously they can't necessarily come into the workshops and like see that I'm an inclusive practitioner or trying to be as much as possible. But like through the essay, I'm not just simply writing about how to be more inclusive and how to kind of create moments for learning opportunities as opposed to moments of doubt.
Yeah, you're embodying that radical empathy that you're talking about.
And I felt like that was quite important in that the physical submission played as key part of a role as the theory within it. I feel like I rambled a lot then, so please like...
And I think what you're saying there about kind of embodying things is one of the key... You were telling me earlier, it's one of the key kind of differences between art and design.
Yeah, I feel like I relate... My sister's at uni for fine art, and we had a few conversations recently, and I feel like there are some differences as to why I don't necessarily consider myself an artist, but I've always considered myself a designer. And I feel like for me, the process, this idea of iteration and improvement is really important. It's not just one final piece, it's kind of just everything and then doing it again and again and again. And I feel like like that kind of embodiment also happens with tools. And I feel like obviously artists, I think, can have like the paintbrush as an extension of their body. But then I feel like with making and designing, it's also then being able to design within the constraints of the machines or the tools or your own abilities sometimes. And so that the more that you use the tools, the more you can design for them and against them and pushing certain boundaries a certain way. And you start to think almost like within the machine, but then also outside of the machine of like, okay, well, I want to make this, but then this machine means that I can't, I don't know, let's say like the laser cutter here is 400 by 600 millimeters is the bed. And you want to make something bigger. It's like, okay, well, what can I do to make sure that that works out? Do I just change the measurements? Do I think of a way to attach two pieces of like material together so that they can be the size that I initially want them? Or can I design everything within the constraints of the laser cutter and then kind of like start designing within the 400 by 600 or whatever size the machine is, as an example. And I find that a lot with the students eventually. They'll kind of like, and I think I still do that to an extent, especially with like measurements. You kind of start, okay, well, I guess this measurement will do. You kind of roughly go off a standard, but then it's the joy of like the puzzle.
Yeah, the joy of the puzzle.
The joy of the puzzle of like figuring out, okay, well, if I make this 200 millimeters instead of, I don't know, 250 millimeters, it means that I can fit two of them per sheet, which means that I can be twice as fast and twice as efficient, even though those like 50 millimeters, like they were just pulled out of nowhere. And then I don't know where I'm going with this.
No, but it's kind of like listening to your intuition, but also allowing the things that you're working with to guide you intuitively through the practice. So like I was writing about knowing and not knowing, and I often find myself kind of intuitively informed by the thing that I'm working with in order to find the edges of it or the constraints of it. Yeah. So I think what you're saying is like the students are sort of, they're not knowing. So they're going, okay, well, 250 millimeters is a rough measurement of what I want. But then it's your job as the technician to sort of go, well, actually, if you reevaluate that and you work within the constraints of the equipment for 200 millimeters, then it's better for everyone and everything. You know, you're not using as much waste, you're not losing as much material through waste. It's much more efficient. And then, but that applies to everything, like letting the world kind of guide your choices. It's like you can throw something out there, but then the environment that you're putting it into, or the tools that you're working with, kind of speak back to you.
Yeah.
And it's your job to be sensitive and to listen.
I think I really like what you just said about like the tools speaking back to you. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. And also I think there's an element of the knowing and not knowing, and the only way you get from not knowing to knowing is by doing. Yeah. And like that's where I personally sometimes can get a bit bogged down in the details of the measurements and blah blah blah, blah and trying to get it perfect, when really I just need to do it, and then I'll know that it doesn't fit, or I know that if I change it by a couple of millimeters, it can fit twice as I can fit twice as many, and it's trying to find that balance between telling them before they even started making something, thinking, okay, well, think about what you're going to use as like what machine, how are you going to machine this, and how does that impact the way that you're designing this, but then also leaving it open enough so that if they try and make it and it doesn't work, then there's like an opportunity to learn. And I feel like they'll more likely remember that moment and why it didn't work and why it's more efficient to do it this way. And then they'll know for next time. And I feel like that's the thing, is like with the iteration, it's like the more you do it, the more you know. And I feel like the more you know, the more it becomes like a part of you. Yeah. In the same way, like the way I try to describe it to some of the students when like teaching them how to use a drill, for example, is at first you don't know how to use this, and that's fine, but you need to get used. Like, you know, the more you use it, the more comfortable you'll be, and the more comfortable, the more confident you'll be, and the less likely you'll like hurt yourself, because you'll know, you know, how it talks back to you. In the same way that teaching a child how to brush their teeth for the first time, and they're just like all over the place, but then now, usually when you brush your teeth, you don't actually have to think about where the toothbrush is. It's just kind of become an extension of your hand. And I feel like very passionately that it's the same with tools. And the more you use them, the more they become an extension of yourself. And then there's like a type of like almost automation where you don't even have to think about them anymore. Yeah. And I think that's where you can really kind of push what you can do with things.
Yeah, because I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier with this kind of dictated, like didactic knowledge of, okay, you mustn't run in the workshop, you can't wear headphones, and you have to tie your hair back, because those are like the practical things. But it's the same when you use a drill. Like someone can tell you, okay, like this is how you insert the drill bit, you need to put the screw on the end of it, and then you're going to like place that against the wood and keep it perpendicular, and then you're going to drill it in. Like someone can tell you that, but it doesn't provide you with the embodied knowledge that doing that does. Yeah. Which is why you have to practice. Yeah. In order to...
And that's the thing as well, I find, like, there's only so many times you can be told the same thing over and over again, but unless you have a go, it's so much, like, it's so hard to kind of fathom. And that, like, I always try and push kind of like thinking through making, and like learning by making, learning by doing. And sometimes like I still have to do it when I do workshops on kind of bookbinding, the kind of page to signature to Word document calculation of how many pages I need. I need to make it. Because I know in theory, I know the numbers that I need to have in order to make sure that at the end of the day, all the pages are filled and it doesn't look a bit funky when we go and print it. But if I don't practice it frequently, I need to make myself my little prototype again to kind of go through it and explain it. And as soon as I figure it out, I'm like, yeah. And that process of like figuring it out for yourself, I think is so important.
I think you've already said it.
Yeah, it's
Like, it's important to figure it out for yourself, because there's only so much that can be gained from being told something.
Yeah.
And I think it comes back to, like, the education system in the UK. I don't know about your education, but it's very much you sit at a desk, a teacher shows you something on a whiteboard, you write it down, and then you have to recall the same things in an exam. And very little of it, unless it's PE, a very little of it is actually doing something.
Yeah. I remember, because at school I went through like French primary school, and that's very much just like, this is it, and you learn it by heart, and then you recite it. Like, I literally had to learn poems by heart and then go in front of the whole class and recite them to the class. And then sometimes it's like you say, did you say autodidact? Did you say
Didactic.
Yeah. We had this thing called autodicté, where basically you had to learn a text by heart, and then you'd come in on the Monday, and then you'd have to write it word for word, comma for comma, on your page again, and then hand that in.
Wow.
I was not a great fan of that.
No, but that's more extreme than what I experienced at school. So
yeah, and like, you know, for every missed comma, that's like one less point. I mean, a very French way of looking at it. But then when I went to international school, and my dad's a teacher, and I think I was like year 11, and we had a personal project, and I was like, I'm going to build a bike. And I was building this bike, and then my dad was kind of like showing me how to go about building this bike. And I was like, oh, okay, like, blah, blah. And he was telling me about like, oh, you know, you've got different ways of learning, and you've got auditory, rote, kinesthetic.
There's like the watching, the touching, the hearing, the reading one.
Yeah.
There's a few different
There's quite
styles
a few
of
ones,
learning.
and he was just like, oh, you're definitely a kinesthetic learner, which is basically like learning by doing. And that's when I was like, oh, wait, yeah, because if you show me how to do something, so for example, on the computer, let's say, I'm on Adobe, I'm on InDesign. If someone takes the mouse and shows me, you need to go there, you need to go there, you need to go there, and even if I'm taking notes, not gonna remember that well. But if someone stands behind me and I have the mouse in my hand and I do the clicking, you show me once and I'm good to go.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I really try and push forwards in the workshops, is like making sure that there's like loads of different ways to go about learning how to use things and like the processes. But at the end of the day, like a big part of my demonstration and my teaching is like, okay, well, I've shown you how I do it, let's do it together, and then you have a go at doing it on your own, whilst I'm kind of watching just in case you have any questions or whatnot. Because I feel like them feeling like the weight of the drill while still being supported by having someone there, like I can't describe that to them.
Yeah.
In the same way, to the same detail as they'll experience it.
Yeah. It's a bit like in Grey's Anatomy, where they say, okay, you're going to see one, you're going to do one, you're going to teach one, with the medical procedures.
Yeah.
I feel like it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So maybe the next step in your practice is to get the students teaching each other.
I have done that, and that's very useful when it's really busy.
Okay, that's
so
good.
I'm like, okay, so you're going to open up Cura, and you're going to download this, and then this is the way that you're going to get your model on there, and this are the settings. Okay, now you're going to show so-and-so to do the same thing, and all together we'll see if you can remember how to do it. And then it's just like a chain reaction, and it makes it so much easier, because there's only one of me, but there'll be like sometimes like 15 of them trying to download Cura.
Yeah.
And I always remember, like at school as well, like if I could teach someone how to do it, I was like, I know this.
Yeah.
And I think every time you teach someone how to do something, I feel like, well, at least for me, every time I teach a student how to use a ruler and knife properly, or every time I teach a student how to cut a piece of wood with a backsaw, and I show them and I practice, my cutting skills have gone through the roof since starting this job.
Yeah.
And I feel like you get to improve your own practice every single time as well.
Yeah. So let's go back to what you were saying about your printing publications and bookbinding and things, because when you're making your mock-up version, Can we talk about the resolution? Because we were talking about this earlier. Your first iteration of these documents, what are you thinking about when you're making those?
So for example, let's take the example of my latest essay, which is...
It's called Technicians' Pedagogical Constellations.
And it's kind of like almost like a mini research proposal into researching technicians' pedagogy. I can never say the word 2 years on. And I had an idea that I wanted it to be bound a certain way, so that you had to take it apart and flip it inside out in order to read it, because technicians have always been, in the few papers that I've been able to find about technicians and teaching, they're always described as invisible. So I wanted the essay to be invisible from the start. Like, you had to go digging to go and find the information. And I was trying to figure out, how can I bind it in a way that means that you can take it apart easily for someone that doesn't necessarily know how to bookbind, but then can be put back together and is all in one piece. And so I was thinking about like folding methods and like this notebook that I'd been given for my birthday, like trying to kind of deconstruct it in my head without actually like damaging it. And I sat on the tube and I was like, I think I figured it out. And I was so scared to forget it that I just grabbed my sketchbook and I teared a piece off and started manically like folding it together in certain ways and making holes with my pencil of where the binding was going to go to see if it would work. And that was like the first iteration of it. The first prototype was just like on the Jubilee line. rush out.
So it was whatever piece of paper you could get hold of.
Whatever piece of paper I could get hold of, like whatever material. And I was like, I just need to physically see it, because I was doing a few sketches, but I was like, I feel like I need to make it to understand if this will work, and if it doesn't, what do I need to do to make it work? And then I realized, okay, well, I need to fold it a certain way, and I need to have like a certain amount of margin, and I need to have a certain amount of pages for it to fit properly. And that was like the first iteration. And then the second iteration was, I think, still on the tube, but just like, okay, like how many holes do I want in it for it to then bind properly? And then the second iteration was, I think, more digitally at that point. How do I translate this thing onto InDesign? Is it just one big page? Is it just multiple pages? And then what I should have done is looked at the size of the page on InDesign and quickly made a prototype, because it was like 3 meters long, and see if I can fold it the way that I wanted to, instead of designing the whole thing on InDesign and then just hoping for the best. Because printers smell fear. They will know that you're stressed out. And they will not behave. And I'm also notoriously bad at folding things. But in theory, it worked. But then in practice, I was like, oh wait, I didn't leave any room, any margin for error, and I'm folding a 3 meter long piece of paper. The tolerance is 0. If I don't fold it perfectly, it ain't gonna work. Some of the pages were just like folded in the rock section.
Right.
But I had tested it in like a 1:2 scale, and that kind of worked. But then I hadn't obviously just practiced folding it. Because it worked. I just needed to sit down and just practice doing it. And then I realised, look, I'm short on time. I'm just gonna have to find a different way to do it. And then that's where I guess like third or fourth like proper iteration of it, where I printed it on A4 and then like folded them that way and kind of then created an accordion kind of like fake.
Oh, okay.
And kind of going back on the idea. And I still think about it now, because since then I have learned that I can print double-sided on the plotter printers.
Okay.
And the temptation to try again is there. I want to give it another go. I want to make it work how I had envisioned it. And I think that's kind of like the process. It's like it starts with something so low res as a piece of paper folded on the tube into kind of like a quite technical understanding of like the plotter printer and kind of like InDesign and margins and like cutting and folding properly.
And the limitations of the material and the skills.
Yeah. It was one of those where I was just like, oh, like my limitation here is my skill. And that skill is limited because I haven't practiced enough. Because I thought I was better than that. I thought I was better than having to learn how to fold paper again. And also time. It had to be submitted.
Yeah.
And at one point you have to just kind of decide, right, well, maybe I need to go down a res.
Yeah. Yeah, down a step
in order to submit something complete. Because with Emma we've been talking about low res and high res in like different formats. And then I guess that was an example of where something one step down in resolution but done really well was better than one step up in resolution but then not quite executed well enough for the idea to be conveyed.
Yeah, or to be realised in a manner that would be received with kind of respect for it.
Yeah.
Because it comes back to that, if you do something well, it could be good.
Honestly, Sean Hall, that bloody lecture.
Yeah, he said that in one lecture. If you do something well, it could be good. And Celeste has written it down, and we throw it at each other every now and then. This is an example of...
But yeah, if it's done well, it could be good. If it's done badly, it could still be good. If it's done well, it could be bad.
Yeah. So you
and if it's done badly, it could be bad. It's like a nothing sentence.
It is, but
it's everything.
But it's everything, yeah. But it's that thing of, okay, this highest resolution isn't going to work for what I want, what I need, what I'm able to do right now. So let me just wind it back a step and do it really well, and then it will be good.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that comes into this conversation of resolution is like priorities. So with that first iteration where you're on the tube folding a piece of notebook paper, stabbing a pencil through it and looking like a madwoman, which we love, we're here for that, the priority there was to see if something worked. You were testing concept, you were sketching. And then each iteration of that, the priority then becomes, okay, I've worked out how this is going to fold. So the next step is, how am I going to put the information on there? Okay, I'm going to use InDesign. So then that's the next iteration. But as you're kind of going from this unknowing through to knowing, you're learning things. And so the priority changes as you acquire the knowledge needed to do the thing. And then once you reach the top end, the priority is then, okay, I need this to look professional, or I need this to look well done. So where on this scale of resolutions is best for me to insert myself and do what I need to do? So yeah, it's kind of like zooming in and zooming out based on your priorities.
Yeah, and I think you can like zoom out and see, okay, well, I need this to be done because I'm submitting it. But then you need to zoom in properly and see, okay, well, in order, like, instead of seeing that as just one big step, there's like, okay, no, well, first I just need to figure out if this kind of like vague idea that I have in my head on the tube works. And then kind of like really breaking it down into smaller chunks, but more than just smaller chunks, like smaller iterations of themselves, which I think is like the number one advice. Like, oh, just break it down into smaller pieces and then tackle those. What you said about priority and why you're doing that step that way, and why is it that at the end goal you need something professional and you need something to be submitted for marking. Why wouldn't you just do it once and do it well? And I have the do it once and do it well disease sometimes, where I'm like, if I just do this once and I just do it really well, then that's great. And I can, maybe if I just plan everything to the nth millimeter, I can just do it once and I've done it well enough and that's fine. And it never works out.
No.
It never works out.
No.
And I also am terrible perfectionist. So for me, the idea of doing something that I know is going to look shoddy just doesn't always compute. And I really have to really have to train myself to be like, no, like this is going to look terrible. However, what you're getting out of it is your idea works or your idea does not work.
Proof of concept.
Proof of concept. So instead of spending like hours and hours on InDesign, kind of creating this document that actually may or may not work, it is useless. No matter how pretty it looks on the computer, if physically the folding doesn't quite work out how I thought it would with the binding, there's no point in that.
Yeah.
And I find like I really have to, I fall out of the habit of that. I fall out of the habit of doing low res to eventually reach high res.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm like, no, high res, straight away, just once. It's just like, doesn't work.
Well, I think you can, because I think it just depends on what the process is, because you can do a high res thing straight away if you've got a very clear image of it in your mind, and perhaps it's something you've done before.
Yeah, but I think that's something that you've done before.
But then you kind of have to look at it and go, is this doing what I want it to, what I'm asking it to, what it's is it serving its purpose? And from there you kind of have to unpick it and almost like scale back and reverse engineer. So in a sense, is there anything to be gained from doing that at all? And like my thought here was, are people gonna, like people listening to this, are they gonna know that your process, like how do you come up with the original idea that forms this process? What it was this tiny little idea of invisible technicians, which then becomes, okay, how can I physicalize that? I'm gonna hide it in the intricacies of my publication, which then had you folding paper in your brain, which then had you making like a little sketch model, which then kind of expanded out into like the final piece of what the essay ended up being, both in physical and I can imagine content form. So yeah, like I think it comes from that. You only need a teeny little baby idea.
Yeah.
And then from there you can let that inform your other decisions.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like what we were saying about the laser cutter of, okay, so you need an idea 250mm, but then you walk over to the laser cutter, or actually it's 200, and then that informs your decisions going forward.
Yeah.
And it's the same with this, like you've got this little idea, it's kind of like a domino effect of that then prompts you to be like, okay, how can I do this? Okay, I'm gonna like hide it. How can I hide it? I'm gonna fold some paper. And then the idea builds outwards from that. And I think you were saying this of like having a cone of zooming in and zooming out.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can explain that any better.
Of like, so when we were talking about this, and I was talking to my sister about it, was I remember at uni we had the hate brief, and we had to do a whole project about something that we hated. And some people hated something really big, and then they kind of zoomed in on a particular aspect as to why they hated this big old thing. You have the flip idea of starting with something really specific and small, and then zooming out, and where does that in what context does that sit in? So for example, for my hate project, mine was about hating the fact that when I microwave my soup, the bowl is hot, but the soup is still cold, which is a pretty specific thing to hate. And really what it kind of boiled down to was I'm expecting something and it's not there, you know? It's like I'm expecting the soup to be hot and then it's actually cold. And there's also the history of like the microwave, and then I kind of like then did a bit of okay, well, I'm microwaving my soup. Technically, how does a microwave work? And also socially, where does the microwave sit in, you know, in the kitchen? Pretty political area of the house. And then kind of zooming out and seeing, well, actually loads of stuff kind of interact with that very specific moment, and then kind of like zooming back in, okay, well, what do I want to do with that? Created something to make things more efficient, and actually it would have been more efficient for me just to put my soup in a pan and reheat it. So yeah, it's just kind of like zooming in, zooming out, and then seeing how everything kind of relates to one another.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of mind maps.
Oh, right.
And seeing how things connect because then I can, like, all my thoughts can jump from one thing to another quite quickly, and I can see how they all connect to one another, and then seeing which areas have the most connections as well.
Right.
And I find, like, that a nice way of seeing, like, the bigger picture and the smaller picture all at the same time. Most of my projects I start with a mind map.
So with your mind maps, where they perhaps have more concentrated connection, is that often the place that you're most interested in? Or are those two things disconnected? Like, is there a correlation there, I think is what I'm asking.
I think there's a few things. I think there's a correlation of maybe that's the area I know a lot about already. So maybe, like, kind of got that covered. Maybe I should focus on an area that's a bit sparse, especially when it's about, like, essay writing, or like kind of like trying to plan out, like, one of my essays. And if I've got, like, a part which is just, I tend to work with my essays in the same way I used to write them in geography, with SEEP. So social, political, environmental and economic impacts as a general rule, and then I kind of go into more detail. So I start with those, and then if there's one area that's, like, super populated, I'm like, okay, I've got quite a few references for this already. This area, for example, I don't know so much about, so maybe I need to look into that first.
Yeah.
Or it will be because I'm really interested in that one area, and then maybe that's the area that I want to push the project in.
Yeah.
So it kind of depends why I'm doing the mind map. Is it to figure out what I want to do, or is it to figure out what I'm interested in?
Or to figure out what you know.
Yeah,
and
or
what
to
you
figure
don't
out
know.
what I know and what I don't know. But I find as well sometimes, like, similar words will kind of crop up every now and again, or, like, I'll find, like, the same, like, one specific thing that I've written kind of applies to loads of different things, and I feel like, yeah, that'll be like a hub of interest. And I also quite like, you can always see, like, different layers of it. As we were talking outside, you've got kind of, like, especially if you start with, like, your theme, and then if you go with, like, the references of things that you know, then personal experiences, then mixing the two, you've kind of got, like, these different layers. And then it's like, okay, well, at what point does the layer become something new, as opposed to something you have already experienced or you already know? And kind of, like, pushing that idea broader outer sphere.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense. I'm making loads of hand movements.
Yeah, just concentric circles, I think.
Right.
Circles nested
Or
within each
spiral.
other. Yeah, or a spiral. Yeah, because I think what you're saying there is very much almost like a self-diagnostic way of sort of going, okay, this is what's in my brain, let me get it out on paper. And my process is kind of similar, but generally I don't make a mind map. Generally, I find that whatever is sitting at the front of my mind is the thing. And I've had to sort of train myself and learn to listen to my own brain. But the thing that I'm thinking of the most, or the thing that's, like, spinning round and round in my head, or that keeps coming up, is the thing that is most relevant, or the thing that I need to write about, or the thing that I need to find a connection between what I'm doing. And generally, like, I'm just thinking, I wrote something about stock images being disgusting.
Yeah.
And I had all these kind of references in my head, and I just kind of wrote them down in order. I was like, okay, so, you know, John Raffman's Punctured Sky is disgusting because John Raffman's been called a sex offender, and it looks like he's stealing all these images to make his own work that he's then putting in fine art galleries. And then it was like, you know, several other references all about stock images. So I just wrote them down in order, and I was like, okay, that's my starting point. And then I built outwards from that in order to link them together. But I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, the fact that, like, yours seems to, like, you have an idea and there's, like, almost like an order.
Yeah.
And it's almost like you have the idea that's at the forefront of your mind, and you write that down, and then you have access to the one that was maybe just behind it, and then the one that was just behind it, and there's, like, an order. Whereas I feel like in my brain, like, there isn't just, like, okay, there's one idea here, and then I just, like, peel back the layers to then get, like, a kind of like quite an ordered thing. It's just like everything is flying around everywhere, and I just need to grab one and then just put it down, and then I grab the next one, and I'm just like, okay, well, this kind of relates to this bit, and they're all there constantly, but they're not necessarily ordered. And then I think that's where the mind map gives me enough freedom to, like, kind of place them, but then still be able to relate them to one another. God
Yeah.
forbid someone has to try and like read my mind map and understand it. In fact, I had to submit a mind map, and it was my first draft, and it was before I kind of simplified it. The feedback was like, it's kind of like a Smallsborg. I think you might need to simplify this slightly. And I was just like, you asked me for a mind map. I have given you
I've given you a mind map,
an A2 mind map about my thoughts on teaching and learning.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of on you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like I also go like my brain is just like one huge tangent, and it goes from one thing to another very quickly.
Yeah.
And so I feel like sometimes I don't even mean to make it a mind map, and it just ends up being one.
Yeah.
Because I'll start with one thing, and then I'll get another very similar process to yours, but then suddenly I'm like, oh yeah, well I forgot about that bit, and then so I write it down, and then I kind of like make a loop, and then I kind of draw an arrow back to it, and then I feel like that's how I can see all of the thoughts at once and see how they can kind of connect to one another, because I'm a big fan of connecting things to one another.
Yeah. So, but then how from that process do you discern what the most important thing is? Because what I've found is that I've been describing things as like almost, you know, like when you go gold mining as a kid. I think I did it at like Legoland or something, like totally not where you're supposed to be gold mining, but they give you like a tray and you have to like shake the stones
like
through the tray, and then you get like the little pieces that kind of like you can then see
the golden
nuggets, and then you put them in your little box that they've given you to put them in. But I think that's how I've sort of been describing my creative practice in my writing, is like I've got this big tub of like gravel and sand and mud,
aggregate.
Whatever it is, I don't know what it is, and you sort of have to just spend time shaking it, and then slowly the things that are important or the good bits are the things that get stuck and left, and then you can see them. And I think it was the same with this stock images thing of we were talking about digital cultures, and we were talking about like image making, and we've been to these really posh art galleries, and like I'm not an artist, so I wasn't relating, and I was like, okay, what's coming up for me? And I was like, okay, like stock images are coming up, disgust is coming up, and this kind of idea of like taking things that aren't yours and like making them into something that could maybe be yours. And so those were the things that came up, and I was like, okay, that's the trajectory for the writing. How do I write that? And then I wrote it.
But you say that how is the trajectory, and then I wrote it. Surely, like, do you just have, your list of all the things and you got your golden nugget, and then you just do it? Is there like a slight transition from like here's the gold I panned for in Legoland, and now I'm writing? Is that really? Do you just go from like, okay, well that's it, to just writing? To a certain extent, yes. It's like I know that I've got these 3 or 4 like themes and ideas, and I've got these 3 or 4 reference points. And then I kind of, somehow the order just naturally, like my brain just goes, okay, this is first, this is second, this is third. And then like weave the narrative or whatever point I'm trying to make through that. But then I do have to take moments of pause to go, am I really writing about this thing and doing it justice? So like, have I done a little bit of descriptive writing about it? Have I use that description to kind of entwine it with the issues that I'm concerned with? And then from there it is a slower process than perhaps I'm making out to be. It isn't just, okay, these are the things, okay, now I write it. It's like, this is the order, this is the trajectory, these are the ideas, and then you have to go through and flesh that out. So I suppose it is iterative in that sense of like, it starts with a bullet point list, and then it becomes perhaps like 4 or 5 images that I found, and then it becomes like descriptions of each of the things, and then it becomes like critical analysis of the things,
and then it becomes linking, and then it becomes an essay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before you know it, you've just written it.
But yeah, I think what I'm trying to ask is like, how do you shake your stuff to the surface?
I think, so I'm like sitting there with my huge mind map, and then I'll start kind of like researching one area, and then I'll go into a rabbit hole, and then I'll just kind of, I'll kind of lose between 3 to 5 hours of just reading about whatever thing I'm interested in, and then by that point, I have turned into mush and nothing, and then I'm like, I need to get away from the computer, and then I'll do something completely different. If I bump into anyone, I'll probably complain about something, about the thing that I'm supposed to be writing about or like designing. And then I'll do something completely different. I'll either tidy up but just do something away from the screen, and then like I'll make something, and then usually subconsciously through the action of doing something else, like my brain, it's almost like it starts to make sense of the mush, and it doesn't necessarily order it, but I think it kind of starts making bigger connections, and then I'll kind of like, I don't know, I'll be making a tote bag, or I'll be tidying up all the samples, or I don't know, I'll be labeling stuff, and then my brain will just kind of go in a loop and a loop and a loop and a loop and a loop, and then eventually I'm like, oh wait, I know, I just need to fold this thing.
Yeah.
Wait a sec, and suddenly it's just like I'll have like a clip, like a really blurry image, and like vision of like what I want it to be. And then suddenly I'm in the Jubilee line, tearing pieces of paper and folding them and giving them a go. And then it's that like that almost like mini eureka moment of like, wait a sec.
Yeah.
That first kind of like, especially when I'm like, it's about essays, that first translation from theory to physical is usually like the pretty key point of turning it into what it's going to become.
Yeah. So it kind of goes from this complete immersion in the thing that you're investigating.
Yeah.
To then sort of a digestion of it, where you're sitting with it. You're not necessarily acting on it. You're just sitting with it.
And I can sit with something for a really long time.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes I'll also like talk to people about it. And I'll kind of like preface this with, I don't have any finished thoughts about this thing, but I've just spent 5 hours researching this thing. Do you want to hear about it? Yeah. And then someone will really nicely say, yeah, sure, fine, I'll sit through this. And then through talking, they'll either make interjections or like have opinions, or maybe even just try not to fall asleep. And then through the act of talking about it, I myself realize, okay, well, this is the bit that I'm interested in, or these bits definitely connect to one another. This bit I can't explain, and if I can't explain it to someone like Emma, who knows loads about my practice and who knows loads about language and design, and she's not able to kind of figure out what I'm trying to say, then maybe I need to workshop that a little bit more. But I feel like a lot of it will happen almost like the distilling process. I feel like a lot of that will happen when I'm making, but I need that initial information input to then kind of distill as I'm doing something else. And then as soon as I've made a link between the two, I'm like, yes. Sometimes I can be quite stubborn. Sometimes I'll have an idea of how I want something to be before I've kind of figured out what it's actually about just yet. I find that quite difficult to kind of like move away from that initial idea. Yeah. And then
I think that's something we were sort of like, that was bashed out of us at Goldsmiths, was like, your first idea is going to be fine, but it's not going to be great, is it?
Yeah. And I find that really hard, because then sometimes it's like, I don't know, I remember like in DT at school, something, it's like you need to present 5 to 10 different ideas for this logo. And like the first one is the one that I'm really interested in, and then the rest are just like fillers.
Yeah.
And what I need to realise is like, I can, like, that first idea can just be a starting off point, and then keep going and like jumping from one thing to another through that first one, that first idea can just be like a jumping board.
Yeah.
And then you can move away from it.
Yeah. Because when they say they want 10 iterations, it's almost like you should do 3.
Yeah.
And then pick one to do 6 more of.
Yeah. And then, like, because then I feel like it doesn't feel genuine. Like, I'm in my head, like, these are just fillers. I don't care about these ones. They're just there to fill up the space. And sometimes as well, I also find it hard when I have an idea and I want to make it work and it just doesn't quite work. The physical doesn't quite represent the theory that I'm writing about, or the theory, and the more I'm doing research about the theory, isn't actually what I thought it was going to be at first. So like my assumptions weren't quite right, and sometimes you just, okay, I just need to move away from that idea, and I just need to move and try and move on, and I find that quite hard. I get a bit attached.
But you probably needed to go and do that thing in order to be able to shelf it and move on.
And just give it a go. Like, there was this one poster and I had this idea of like all these different lenses and these different colours, but I couldn't quite make sense of it, and I couldn't quite make sense of the essay itself. I was really confused about the theory, and then also like I was then confusing myself with the physical, which isn't really the process. Usually the physical kind of helps me make sense of the theory, and then as soon as I started understanding the theory a bit more, I then had a much clearer vision of the physical. And I've also had it go the other way round. It's like as soon as I understood what it looked like physically, suddenly I was like, okay, yeah, no, I get this.
Yeah.
Like, there was one about kind of like module evaluations, and then suddenly I was like, I know what this is. This is a Mobius loop. This is just something that feeds into one another, and that it's you can't ever get it done perfectly because it's not real. The perfection of it can't exist.
Is the
right.
Mobius loop the thing where you like make a strip of paper and then twist it and fold it? Not fold it. You twist it around and stick it on itself, and then it makes an infinite path.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like a impossible mathematical shape.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my god, it's just like loads of these kind of like all chained to one another, all kind of like looping into each other. And as soon as I understood what that looked like, suddenly I was like, I understand what this is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just like giving things a go, and then printing things out too many times, making loads of mistakes.
Yeah.
But then as well, going back to, you have one idea and you're like, okay, yeah, this one's my favourite. And then I've had it as well sometimes where I've had some other ideas to kind of like fill it, or like trying to figure out, and then eventually I'm like, I changed my mind. I like this one better.
Yeah.
And it's just like allowing yourself to change your mind, I find quite difficult as a process as well.
Yeah.
I can be quite stubborn.
But again, it comes back to that thing of listening, doesn't it? Like listening to the tools or the materials or to the thing that you're working on. And if the thing says, I'm not working, I don't like this, then it's kind of your responsibility as a practitioner to listen to that and to act accordingly. Yeah.
And I think it's the same with, I find like with writing and making as well, is I find there's the writer making bit, and then there's the analysis / editing moment bit, and I find it really hard to separate them, but I find it a lot easier to separate them in the long run. Like if I just I try really hard to try not to get caught up in the details when I'm in the flow of it. I try and just kind of keep going, like especially with writing, and I'm like, oh wait, no, not quite this word, oh no, I'm not, oh this doesn't look nice, or I'm not explaining myself well. It's just like, no, just write it all and like just go and write, and then later on another version of me will have like editing glasses, and we'll kind of like go through and edit and spice and take things out and put things back in. And I think it is really important to have them separate, but then also have some kind of timer on both of them, because
you have to know when to stop, right?
I have had times where kind of going back into that rabbit hole where I was looking to, like I was writing about like students and agency and the workshops and third spaces, and I ended up like so deep in some kind of, I can't remember, I think it was a study on like Ghanaian education in girls and schooling, and it had nothing to do with the third space, which is what I had started with.
Yeah.
And sometimes like you have to like think, okay, wait, let's regroup. Where am I going with this?
Yeah.
And then I think that's where I find it hard sometimes to know how far deep to go to make sure I know my way back. Then sometimes that's also where you get some pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it, to know when to stop, when to go,
Yeah,
and when to like change lanes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think, yeah, what you're saying about having a time, like having a limit on it and being like, no, this is okay, this is enough. And it's very similar to when you're frantically folding paper on the tube.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of like putting everything down on a page.
Yeah.
Versus going back and like trying with a different piece of paper or like working it up on InDesign. Like it's iterative. It's an iterative process. And I think earlier you were saying something like when you get stuck, like, and you were talking about, I don't know, notions of stuckness and how shifting between theory and between practice frees up that stuckness.
Yeah.
And I think we were also talking about translation.
Yeah.
And so how like translating between medium, so whether that's like theory to practice, or maybe that's a shifting of mode, a translation in mode of, or like reading about something versus writing about something versus talking about something, how that shift, like if you're saying to me, oh, I don't know how to explain this to someone, but then you go and make it, then you then find the vocabulary to explain it through the act of making it. And you're also, is it bilingual or or trilingual?
No,
just
bilingual.
Just bilingual. Okay. You see, I see. I'm trilingual in the sense of I need to try to learn another language.
I'm trying to learn Japanese as well, and I have some Spanish.
But French and English.
But yeah,
are your
French
two
and English
languages.
are my two languages.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's what we talk about. I find myself particularly interested in this kind of like threshold of translation, where it's like that middle ground where you can't get quite the right words to describe something so plainly obvious in French into English, but then also not trying to lose any of the essence of what the French sentence is trying to say, but then also realizing that there's something embodied about, and like there's an embodied experience in knowing it in French that you can't quite translate into English, or for someone who doesn't know how to speak French, because it's just like a whole other system of understanding and knowing that they don't, and like trying so hard to translate that I find fascinating. And I think, yeah, it's in that threshold of just like theory into physical. How can the two combine into that one thing? How can I make them both exist at the same time?
Yeah.
Like, how can I make both translations exist at the same time and understood both at the same time?
Yeah.
Like, I want all of them.
Yeah.
But then it's the same with, it's just like a thresh. It's the same with kind of like the third space, and like I feel so akin to some of the students, but I'm not a student. But then but I'm not quite a tutor because I don't mark and I don't have work allocated teaching whatever it is, and it's just like that, like in between.
Yeah.
That like kind of almost like limbo.
Yeah.
Bit.
So just to make this clear because Celeste is talking about it like the third space, like we all know what she's talking about. Because she's not an academic tutor on the course here, she's a technician. it's like, I don't know what the first and second spaces are that you're referring to.
So the third space is a space that is separate to your home and is separate to your workplace.
Okay.
So
yeah, so the workshops are not the students' homes. They're not the students' like primary workplace
it's not the studios.
with the academic tutors.
Yeah.
It's kind of this third space where they can play, and it's kind of like a recreational space.
Yeah, it's a space like let me just have a quick look. I think I've got it here. There's like 8 characteristics of a third space, and they describe the workshops quite well. So neutral, leveler, good conversation, accessible. There's some regulars. It's pretty low profile. It's playful, and it's a home away from home. So like your local pub is a good example of a third space. Your park is a good third space. I also kind of see the third space as kind of like, that kind of like in-between state of, well, I have a similar background to some of the students, gone to international school in my 20s, had to do some education during COVID. A lot of the people on the interior design course at Regents are girls and female and women, so on that front we kind of look quite similar sometimes. But then also I'm not a student.
Yeah.
I'm teaching them.
Yeah, you're a facilitator.
I'm still a facilitator. I'm still, they come to me for issues or whatever. But I'm also not a tutor. I don't teach in the same capacities. I don't necessarily have like lectures. I teach, but like it's kind of different in a way.
Well, it's a lot more ad hoc, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's less
ad hoc.
Structured.
It's less structured. I'm not there with a presentation.
You're there to facilitate the learning.
I don't mark. I think that's a pretty important aspect of it as well. And also, I think hierarchically, there's a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
And also where I situate myself, in the workshops, like my job itself is kind of like very related back to the space that I occupy as well. And so that's basically like why I describe like technicians as kind of like a third space. And I think it changes the relationships and the style and like the dynamics. I feel like that's a whole different conversation. Sorry.
It is a whole different conversation, but I think it's a great place to leave this.
Because I can't even remember what you said.
No, honestly, we were talking about thresholds and how translation between like theoretical and practical can almost be like a conduit for kind of understanding things.
Yeah.
And so I think that what you were saying is there's a parallel between that process of translation and then like the occupation of spaces.
Yeah.
So like you're not an academic tutor in the way that like the other people that teach on the course are, but also you're not a student. You're kind of like in between, and you're encouraging this practical application of skills, and therefore the workshops are a space where ideas are kind of brought into reality or catalysed or start to kind of really take off, and then they can take them back to like the very academic places. And
with the threshold thing and the translation, I think the key bit we need to remember is in order to translate, even bring it back to languages, you kind of need to know both languages in order to be able to translate them from one to another. And I think it's then about striking that balance of making sure that you're not relying too heavily on knowing French in order to translate something in English. You kind of have to exist in that middle ground. And I think that's where jumping from one thing to another is like, if I'm spending a lot of time in the theory and I'm like, okay, theory, and then I get stuck at one bit, it's almost like I then have to move to the physical kind of making side and bring that back up as well, so that they're constantly on like a similar level. Yeah. So one doesn't outweigh the other. Yeah. And also I then feel like having a break from one to the other means that I can subconsciously kind of process everything. And I think, I think it's keeping both of them at a similar level.
on even keel,
On
so
even
that they
keels.
can support each other.
So they can kind of flow into one another.
Yeah. And I think that ultimately sort of supports the fact that the workshops are such a valuable place. Because while all the academic knowledge is great, if you're in a design department, then you need workshops, and you need the workshop staff. And I think that's why we sort of decided to have this discussion in the first place, was because we were talking about the importance of the technician and how so often they kind of fall behind the scenes and then become invisible, and that shouldn't be happening.
No.
Basically.
No, it shouldn't. Because I mean, the reason I ended up in loving uni so much is thanks to the technicians at Goldsmiths, really. That's how I figured out how much I like. I mean, I initially thought I was going to go into graphic design.
Yeah.
And then, like, through Ava, through Faith, like, through so many of my technicians at Goldsmiths, I realised, like, oh, wait, I'm a big fan of making stuff. And realising that I can make stuff and understand theory through that. And, like, kind of making to understand, like, thinking through making, understanding through making, like, knowing by doing. I feel like that exists in the workshops, and that is facilitated by the technicians. And I think that's where there could be a potential for really interesting research, and where there is currently a gap in the research.
The discourse.
And discourse about technicians and how we teach and our place in the higher education landscape. I think it's a big missed opportunity. Yeah.
Well, that's part of the reason why I asked to talk to Celeste as my first little podcast guest. So thank you to anyone who has listened to this, and listen up for the next one. And maybe we'll have to get Celeste back at some time to talk some more. Thank you.
Thank you.